Points. There have been more than 100 reported coronavirus cases in New York State. How Governor Cuomo and other officials are tackling the outbreak.
And on the campaign trail, Joe Biden dominated Super Tuesday, the full results of last week's primaries, and how it will play out for the rest of the race.
And the race for the White House continues. What to watch for as 6 more states head to the polls. Talking Points starts right now.
This evening, the White House task force updated the nation on the U.S. response to the coronavirus. Good evening, I'm Sabrina Maggiore.
And I'm Conor Wight. President Trump was in attendance. He announced that he will propose a payroll tax cut and a way to relieve hourly workers to Congress. He said that the disease has, quote, blindsided the world.
It has now been over a week since New York had its first confirmed case of the coronavirus. While public health officials continue to work to contain the virus, looming uncertainties have left New York residents with many questions.
Joining us in studio today to hopefully answer some of those questions is Analyst Augustus LeRoux. What can you tell us about the latest?
What can be said right now is that over the past few months of this outbreak, we have seen several instances where the infection rate has skyrocketed, and New York is no exception. And the week after that first case was reported on March 1st, we have seen the number of cases rise to 142 as of today. In the wake of this, Governor Cuomo announced a state of emergency over the weekend, clarifying as well that 89 of those cases are in Westchester County, 19 in New York City, and the rest spread around the state. It is still important to note, however, that these cases make up less than a fraction of the state's population of nearly 20 million. Despite that, the Department of Health maintains that it will work proactively to prevent any further spread. As for that state of emergency, you can see specifically what it entails right there on your screen, taken right from the governor's website and intended to expedite procedures for medical and research personnel focusing on combating the virus. As for what changes the average citizen will see, nothing major as of yet. Although we have seen the education system deeply rattled by these developments, Fordham, Hofstra, Yeshiva, and Columbia have all either closed indefinitely due to coronavirus cases or switched to remote learning online.
All right, Gus, thank you so much for joining us. So obviously, other nations have struggled to contain this virus. Do you think what's happening here in New York is enough to contain what we've seen, which is a growing number of cases?
I don't think there's anything wrong with a little optimism. Obviously, the health department has been taking steps to ensure that these cases are accounted for. But to echo the same sentiments brought forth by Governor Cuomo today, this is obviously going to get worse before it gets better, as we're seeing this growth at an exponential rate in New York City, or in New York State, actually.
It's something the governor has repeated multiple times, that as they do more testing, cases will rise. But as you mentioned, the number of confirmed cases, for now at least, is a fraction of the state's population. How have New Yorkers been reacting?
There has been rising concerns among New York State. We haven't reached quite so panic levels, but obviously we're seeing a lot of panic buying. Stores are having their entire stocks wiped out. The cost of Purell obviously skyrocketing. Another announcement that came out of Governor Cuomo's office today was New York State actually releasing their own hand sanitizer products in an attempt to combat price gouging. So obviously we're seeing some concerns, but nothing awful yet at this point.
And you mentioned this before, but we've seen a number of schools sort of limit their classes, in-person classes. Do you think school closings is going to have an impact?
I mean, no doubt, obviously, we'll see some school closings and it'll interfere with individuals', education. But the real problem with that is not so much the education, but the amount of people that have come to rely on the school system, particularly lower class or poor people, that do rely on the school systems for even food or just basic necessities, that if this were to trickle down to high schools or elementary schools, we could see some very serious consequences for those that are not as fortunate.
All right, Augustus, thank you very much. And last week, the Supreme Court began hearing arguments for June Medical Services versus Russo. It's a major case that could potentially rid of the constitutional right for women to have an abortion. Wednesday morning, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer spoke at an abortion rights rally, and his remarks quickly generated a response from conservatives. Here to break down what happened is Talking Points analyst Natalie Fahmy. So, Natalie, let's talk about this. Why did Schumer's remarks cause such an outrage?
They caused such an outrage and so much backlash because they were interpreted as physical threats. He said things such as they are going to pay the price and they won't know what hit them. So when he said these remarks, they were perceived as physical threats, which is why so many people reacted to what he said so quickly.
Now, highly politically charged remarks there, and we can assume that reactions fell more or less on party lines. How did elected officials react?
So Trump actually took to Twitter and he said that Chuck Schumer should pay a severe price for this. And we saw that theme among Republican senators as well. They are insisting that Schumer apologizes, and they're saying what he said was not right and that he should pay for this in some capacity. At the very least, apologize. And on the Democratic side, we're seeing a lot of senators defending him, saying it's not in his nature to threaten anybody, but the words that he used, he could have chosen different words, but really it's all fueled by his passion for this case and for a woman's right to choose.
And when you look at Schumer's reaction to this backlash, has he sort of apologized? What action has he taken since then?
He did apologize, and he said that he could have used different words, but at the end of the day, he says he's going to continue to fight for the women of America, and he's not going to back down when it comes to fighting for this case and fighting for a women's right to choose. So while he was apologetic for the specific words he used, he's not apologetic for the rhetoric he was putting out there about this case.
All right, well, Natalie, thank you so much. The race for the White House looks very different following Super Tuesday. The night propelled former Vice President Joe Biden into first place because he won 10 out of the 14 states that were up for grabs. Talking Points analyst Oscar Offerman is in studio now to tell us how this will shake out the Democratic field. Oscar?
Thanks, Connor. Now, Super Tuesday went unlike anything anyone expected. Just 4 days before the primary, it looked as if Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders would sweep through most of the states up for grabs on his way to the Democratic nomination. Now, nothing could be further from the truth. Biden received endorsements before the day from former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg and Minnesota Amy Klobuchar that bolstered his standings in key states. And a Lone Star State endorsement from Beto O'Rourke may have helped swing that state in his favor as well. The former vice president is now one of the two major candidates still in contention for the nomination, along with Bernie Sanders. Sanders had a very disappointing night after high hopes going in. The main blow for his campaign was Texas losing a close race to Biden. Sanders also underperformed in states that he won, including California, where he won by 8%. But polls going in to the night had Sanders as much as 20 percentage points ahead in the state. The late rally from Biden allowed him to both win key states and even pick up vital delegates in the states that he didn't win.
Now, Oscar, you mentioned a little bit there, huge comeback for Biden on the night, especially since his campaign really seemed to be in a disastrous state following Iowa and New Hampshire. How critical was Super Tuesday for this campaign?
It was very, very critical. Let's go back to 4 weeks ago. His campaign looked almost dead in the water. You mentioned it. He finished 4th in Iowa, finished 5th in New Hampshire. He wasn't even the top polling moderate in the field, but along came South Carolina, and he won almost 50% of the vote there, and it propelled his nomination propelled his campaign so much that it forced Buttigieg and Klobuchar to drop out, which in turn propelled him even more into Super Tuesday. So this was probably the defining turning point of the 2020 campaign.
So Biden's looking more and more like a front runner in this race. Do you think that he has certain key states he needs to win in order to sort of continue on this trajectory that he's been on?
Yes, so the states coming up, obviously there's Michigan and states like Missouri and Washington coming up. Now, Michigan and Missouri are much more locks for Joe Biden. That's actually really surprising because Sanders won Michigan in 2016 over Hillary Clinton. And also Washington too, which Sanders was ahead in that state, and now Biden it's sort of neck and neck between Biden and Sanders. So I think he's really going to lock down those states on his way to the Democratic nomination.
So although you can take polls with a grain of salt, it does seem like Biden is poised to continue to take more and more states as we get deeper into this primary race. Does Sanders have a way back?
He has to really propel his campaign forward. I don't think he has a way back at this point. I think Biden is too far ahead in some regards, and I think he's really hurt himself, especially in states like Florida, where he has comments that he praised former Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. He's also said things about Israel that may have upset some Jews in Florida, and those are two of the bases for Democratic voters in Florida is Cuban Americans and Jewish Americans. And so I think he really hurt his standing there, and I think it has translated over to the rest of the country.
All right, Oscar Offerman, certainly going to be an important night for Sanders tomorrow. We'll keep an eye on that. And coming up, the aftermath of Super Tuesday, which candidates have dropped out and what effect it will have in the primary.
And we'll take a look at tomorrow's mini Super Tuesday. Our Spencer Kweskin will break down which states are up for grabs. Stay tuned.
Most party fouls are pretty dumb. But if you decide to drink and drive underage, you could lose your license and your freedom. Underage drinking and driving. The ultimate party foul.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
There's one thing you can never have sex without.
It's not something you buy.
Or something you take.
In fact, there's only one way to get it.
It has to be given to you, freely.
It's consent.
Because sex without it isn't sex.
It's rape. Consent.
If you don't get it, you don't get it. It's on us to stop sexual assault.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
Welcome back to Talking Points Now. One of the biggest consequences of Super Tuesday was the field clearing that happened in the aftermath. Senator Elizabeth Warren and former New York Mayor Mike Bloomberg both left the race after failing to get traction. Talking Points analyst Brandon Ross is in studio to tell us more about why they dropped out and how it's affecting the primary.
Connor, two very major exits after Super Tuesday last week, especially in the case of Elizabeth Warren. She was considered a frontrunner early in the campaign, and that gave her a big publicity boost. But it also put an enormous target on her back, and eventually her popularity faded out. That allowed other candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar to have brief flashes of hope before they dropped out of the race ahead of Super Tuesday, and that day did not go well for Warren. She hardly gained any meaningful delegates, but worst of all, she didn't even win her home state of Massachusetts. Not only did Joe Biden pull the stunning upset, but Warren actually finished in third. That put the writing on the wall as it became more and more clear that Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is the one carrying the progressive mantle in this primary race. Similarly, Mike Bloomberg tried making his case to be the best moderate in the field, but he failed. He gambled all of his chips on a big Super Tuesday performance. Instead, Joe Biden took the moderate lane for himself, and Bloomberg wound up spending $600 million for just one victory in American Samoa. A big reason for his problems was his inability to handle the spotlight once it shined on him. Allegations rose about his mistreatment of women in the past, plus controversial statements about redlining and stop and frisk resurfaced. When pressed on these, he was not very well prepared with responses, and it did not go over very well with voters. And these two dropouts leave three candidates in the race, but realistically, it's now a two-man campaign between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Definitely a wild departure from the beginning of the campaign, which had one of the most diverse fields in recent history. Most impactful from this, though, are the endorsements. Mike Bloomberg has put his support behind Joe Biden, and he is giving him that moderate lane. However, Warren has not endorsed a candidate yet. It's unclear if she will, but both the Biden and Sanders campaigns have reached out in hopes of getting her word. Connor, Sabrina, back to you.
Brandon, thank you very much. And one of the main focal points for Democrats in 2020 has been how to capture and retain minority voters across the country. The top two Democrats left in the fight, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, are the two with the most minority support, specifically Black and Latino support. Talking Points analyst Manny Martinez is with us to take a deep dive into how each candidate stacks up against the others with minority voters.
Well, Sabrina, let's put some context into the 2020 race for the Democratic nomination and, by extension, the race for the White House. According to the Pew Research Center, this year marks the first time that Hispanics and Latinos now comprise the largest minority group of eligible voters in America at 13.3%. That translates to about 32 million raw votes. Blacks now become the second biggest minority group with about 30 million eligible voters nationwide. So how does each Democratic candidate fare against the other? Well, Super Tuesday last week gave us a pretty good look. Joe Biden did really well in getting support from black voters in South Carolina days before Super Tuesday, and he carried that momentum into other states as well. Biden got no fewer than 58% of the black vote in states like Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, and Alabama, where he got 72% of the black vote. And while black voters in those states flocked to Joe Biden, Hispanics and Latinos for the most part stood behind Bernie Sanders. According to exit polls in the state, Senator Sanders got half the votes from Latinos in California and beat Biden by 13 points in Texas with Latinos.
All right, Manny, so obviously this is a crucial base of support for the Democratic Party. When you're looking at the demographics of supporters, though, you noticed a consistent trend. Can you tell me about it?
Absolutely. Age has been one thing that throughout this entire campaign has been quite the deciding factor in terms of what age group is going to vote for who. Sanders has gotten steady support from younger voters, especially amongst Latinos, because the median age of the average Hispanic in this country is 29. And Joe Biden has been consistent in getting older minorities to vote for him, and he's done really well in cleaning up with the older generations.
Now, when it comes to minority voters, who do you think has the advantage here?
Say Joe Biden has the advantage, especially in a couple of the states coming up. Tomorrow, Michigan votes, and there's a big emphasis on the black vote in Michigan, and he actually leads Bernie Sanders in a state that Sanders won against Hillary Clinton back in 2016. Oscar told us that. And the support that Biden is getting from black voters is stronger than the support that Sanders is getting from Latino voters, especially in a state like Florida, and that's in a week.
And when you look at the general election coming up in November, what does what you're seeing now with minorities supporting both of the candidates tell us about what that race could look like?
Well, it tells me that there's strong support within the minority voters, both black and Latino specifically, behind a Democratic candidate. But it's about which one of these two candidates, and it's looking more and more every day like it's going to be Joe Biden, can he unite basically all the minority vote and consolidate it so it becomes one big voting bloc.
All right, well, obviously no demographic votes as a monolith, but this is all very relevant information. Manny, thank you so much. After a great Super Tuesday for Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, the two frontrunners are now looking ahead to tomorrow, which some are calling Mini Super Tuesday, due to 6 states handing out their delegates. Joe Biden became the frontrunner in the Democratic primary after picking up 610 delegates last week, surpassing Bernie Sanders, who is now in second after only gaining 513 delegates on Tuesday. Now, here to break down what the race may look like tomorrow is Talking Points analyst Spencer Kweskin. Now, Spencer, would you be able to break down which states are up for grabs tomorrow and which ones you reckon are probably the most important for these candidates?
Right. So tomorrow there are 6 states that are going to be up for grabs, with 325 total electoral votes going to be handed out. And if we take a look at the map, which should be on your screen right now, we see how Michigan is clearly the biggest prize of the night with 125 electoral voters, followed by Washington State with 89, then Missouri with 68, then Mississippi with 36, then Idaho with 20, and then finally North Dakota with 14. Now, clearly, Michigan is the biggest prize of the night. It's in the state that everyone's talking about, and Joe Biden is leading in Michigan. However, some good news for Sanders might be the fact that Michigan has been quite a battleground state within the past couple of weeks, and it's really been flipping between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So we can't say definitively who's going to win Michigan until the night of. Then some good news for Biden. Biden looks like he's doing really well down in the South and in Missouri and in Mississippi. And then Bernie Sanders looks like he might do well up in the North with Washington, with Idaho, and with North Dakota. So we're just going to have to see how it turns out in tomorrow.
You mentioned that Michigan could be a key player for Sanders' campaign. Does he need to win that in order to move on? Is there a path forward for Sanders, or is he sort of out of it at this point?
Frankly, as of right now, it doesn't look like he really needs Michigan tomorrow. So it doesn't look like without Michigan, he's going to really have a path. And it looks like as of right now, if you asked this question about a week or two ago, this answer would have been completely different. Sanders was leading pretty highly in the polls. He was the candidate favored to win, but now he only has 2% of the vote behind him. And Joe Biden has 88% of the vote, with a contested convention down to being only 1 in 10 or 10% chance. So as of right now, Joe Biden looks like he's going to be taking this race with almost a 9 out of 10 chance of winning the Democratic primary by a plurality of voters. That is more than half the voters that are out there. But there still may be a chance for Sanders, and it looks like Joe Biden may have woken up.
With the Sanders campaign with it all to do. Spencer, thank you so much. Coming up, the Supreme Court is hearing arguments for a case that could determine how much states can restrict abortion clinics. Find out what the decision might mean.
And Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has rescinded a change to how states get school funding. What this means for low-income districts after a break.
Everybody has a dream. mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
They told me a bottle couldn't dream. That I would never become a superhero. But I learned how to fly. Just to come back in a new disguise. And be the hero that I've always wanted to be.
Leaving hot coals improperly extinguished can cause a wildfire.
Hey guys, it's Smokey!
It looks as if Smokey is going to use the drown, stir, drown, and feel technique. After the first drown, a good stir. Next, another drink. And finally, a close feel.
Is it cool? Okay. Yeah.
Hey, Smokey, catch! Oh, my bad, Smokey.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
For the last week, the Supreme Court has been hearing oral arguments for a case that will determine the degree to which states can restrict abortion clinics. The case, June Medical Services versus G, involves around a Louisiana law that requires any doctor performing an abortion to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. Talking Points analyst Michael Fernari is here to break down the specifics of this case and what we can expect from the court's eventual decision.
This is not the first time that a law similar to the one passed in Louisiana has come before the Supreme Court. 3 years ago, the court struck down a Texas law that is incredibly similar to the one in question now. Only then, Justice Anthony Kennedy was the swing vote, and now, the more conservative Chief Justice John Roberts is the swing vote. So, what is the law in question? The law mandates that any doctor performing an abortion needs to have admitting privileges at a nearby hospital. The rationale being that should serious complications occur, that patients would receive the highest quality care. Critics of the bill have argued that the state has not provided adequate evidence that the new law has actually improved safety. They are arguing that it exists only to place an undue burden on clinics. Should the law stand, it may force 2 of the state's 3 abortion clinics to close, leaving only 1 doctor in 1 clinic left. In the 2016 vote, Chief Justice John Roberts dissented and voted to uphold the similar Texas law. And so far, throughout oral arguments, there hasn't been a clear indication that Roberts or Kavanaugh will vote with the liberals to strike down the law. A 5-4 conservative decision to uphold Louisiana's law would be the most substantial ruling on abortion in the last decade, and would be the most significant Supreme Court reversal of precedent in recent memory. This does not mean that Roe v. Wade is in jeopardy, but much of the current legal battle over abortion is about what states can do at the periphery to regulate abortion. But a conservative decision on this case signals a willingness by the court to let states heavily regulate abortion practices to a degree not previously allowed. Conor and Sabrina, back to you.
The Trump administration is backing off from a change they made at the end of February that would have cut federal funds for rural schools. Now, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos will allow easier qualifications for states to get funding under the Rural and Low-Income School Program for an additional year. Talking Points analyst Mariah Humiston joins us to explain what went into this change. Now, Mariah, thank you so much for being here. What were some of those changes that would have actually led to the cuts that the administration was talking about?
The Department of Education discovered that rural and low-income schools were getting most of their funding based off of the amount of students in need for free or reduced price meals, when in reality, the last 17 years, a law that has been loosely enforced meant that they needed to get it based off of poverty level census data from their area. So with the original enforced change, over 800 schools could lose immediate funding, and superintendents were estimating around $30,000 to $100,000 of loss in funding for essential services.
So why did the administration eventually decide to reverse that proposed change?
So a lot of it was time-based. Having 800 schools across the country in rural and low-income areas losing funding was a big conflict, especially for 22 senators, including Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Susan Collins, who signed a bipartisan letter saying that there were rural and low-income schools in their area that we're going to lose funding. Susan Collins estimated that in Maine, around $1.2 million would have been lost in funding if they enforced the law.
Now, is this temporary, or could we see this change come later down the line?
So they're backing off on the change temporarily for 1 year. However, a year from now, they will enforce the law that hasn't really been followed in 17 years, and rural and low-income schools will have to follow a new way to find funding by using the poverty level data from the census instead of free and reduced price meals.
All right, Mariah, thank you very much. Some interesting changes there. When we come back, we'll give you the latest on the coronavirus epidemic across the world.
Got a quarter?
They took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back to Talking Points. There are now over 100,000 confirmed cases of the COVID-19 coronavirus worldwide, with over 3,500 deaths as a result of infection, though it is important to note that over 60,000 of those infected have recovered.
Now, the Italian government is taking drastic measures to try and stop the spread of the coronavirus as the country announced that the entire country is now on lockdown. The Prime Minister announced today that the lockdown would extend to all of Italy after initially locking down just the northern region. All unnecessary travel is prohibited, as are all public gatherings, including sporting events, all of which will be suspended until further notice.
This is an unprecedented move, and it is unclear how implementation and enforcement will actually work. When the initial northern lockdown was announced, multiple local governments complained that they were not given enough notice. Now, Sabrina, I think that's where a lot of the complaints have come from. Obviously, this impacts an unbelievably important country, an unbelievably important European economy, and a ton of people, and it seems like it came sort of out of nowhere.
Right, and I think the big question now is whether or not the Italian people are actually going to adhere to the rules that have been sort of set out. I mean, this was a pretty abrupt decision from the government to extend the lockdown to all of Italy. So the rules for what exactly this lockdown entail have not been made abundantly clear either at this point.
Exactly. We've seen government quarantines work. We've seen it in China. Their number of new reported cases each day has gone drastically down. But we've seen issues there with implementation, and we're likely to see them in Italy, where the government's stronghold on the country is a lot different. We're looking at a democracy there.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we'll keep an eye on for sure. That is all the time we have. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at CitrusTV News and like us on Facebook.
For more full episodes and webisode editions of Talking Points, go to citrustv.com. For all of us here, I'm Conor Wight.
And I'm Sabrina Maggiore. Have a great night, Syracuse.